By midnight, the western gate of Rome had been sealed with wagon wheels, broken doors, and shields carried by men too tired to complain. Beyond it, fires moved across the dark plain where the enemy had camped. Inside the city, Commander Marcus Aelianus counted the soldiers still able to stand. There were not enough of them to save Rome. He knew that before he climbed the wall, before the horns sounded in the distance, before a frightened boy in a borrowed helmet handed him a message stamped with the imperial seal. Rome had ruled provinces, commanded roads, filled harbors, and raised armies across lands that had once seemed beyond measure. Yet on this night, its defense rested on a few surviving companies, a failing wall, and the decisions of people who understood that survival and victory were no longer the same thing. The message was short. The emperor had left the city. No order followed. No destination was given. No promise of reinforcements appeared beneath the seal. The court, the treasury officials, and the senators, who still argued about titles and taxes in marble halls, had gone south before sunset under armed escort. They had taken horses, carts, servants, and grain from the imperial storehouses. Marcus read the message once. Then he held it over a brazier until the wax softened, the parchment blackened, and the emperor's seal curled inward like a dead leaf. Beside him stood Lucius Varro, his standard-bearer. Lucius had carried the eagle of the 7th Legion for many years, though the eagle itself was no longer gold. It had been lost in a retreat long before, along with most of the men who had marched beneath it. What remained was a bronze staff topped with a small iron bird, made by a smith and polished so often that its cracked wings still caught the torchlight. Lucius watched the message burn. "Will you tell them?" Marcus looked down from the wall. The streets below were crowded with people moving in every direction. Families carried bundles toward churches. Shopkeepers dragged shutters across their doors. Old men stood on corners with kitchen knives tucked into their belts, as if a knife could protect a whole neighborhood. A line of civilians waited beside a public fountain where the water had slowed to a thin stream. At the far end of the square, servants pushed a cart piled with silver cups through the mud. "They will know by morning," Marcus said. Lucius gave a tired laugh without humor. "Then perhaps we should tell them something useful before morning." That was the first decision of the night. Marcus could have told the men that relief was coming. It would have been easy. A promise could steady a shaking line. It could persuade exhausted soldiers to lift their shields one more time. But a lie was a kind of debt, and the men under his command had already paid too much for promises made by people who vanished when payment came due. He summoned the officers to the old bathhouse beneath the wall. The baths had been closed for months because the aqueduct feeding them had been cut. Their marble floors were dry and cracked. The warm rooms smelled of ash, wet wool, oil, and blood. A brazier burned in the center, and around it stood the people expected to defend the western gate. There was Decimus, a cavalry captain with only a handful of horses left in his troop. There was Sabina, who had once trained recruits in barracks along the Tiber and now commanded infantry after every senior officer above her had died, deserted, or been sent elsewhere. There was Cassian, a former city watchman whose men knew the streets better than they knew military drills. There was Brother Paulus, a priest who had become useful because he could read, write, bind wounds, and persuade frightened civilians to move when soldiers could not. And there was Tiro. Tiro was young enough that no one was certain of his age. He had joined the Legion after his father died in a grain riot. His armor belonged to another soldier. His sandals were too large, and he still looked surprised whenever anyone called him by rank. He had been assigned to carry water and messages. That evening, someone had put a spear in his hands because there were no more men available for lighter duties. Marcus laid out the situation plainly. The enemy had crossed the river before dusk. Their scouts had been seen near the western road. Their main force would likely wait until dawn, when it could attack with light behind it and use the ruined outer suburbs for cover. The wall was strongest near the gate, but the gatehouse had lost part of one tower in an earthquake years earlier. The city had food for only a short time, perhaps less if panic spread. The soldiers had enough arrows for one serious defense. There were no reinforcements on the road. Sabina listened without moving. Decimus stared into the brazier. Cassian cursed under his breath. Then Marcus said what they had all been waiting to hear. "The Emperor has gone." No one answered at first. The silence was not disbelief. It was recognition. Men and women who had spent years in uniform knew the shape of abandonment. They recognized it in empty supply wagons, sealed offices, missing pay chests, and orders written by officials who would not share the danger they described. Cassian was the first to speak. "Then the city is finished." "No," Marcus said. "The city may be taken. That is not the same thing." Cassian looked at him sharply. "A city is stone, roofs, storehouses, markets, graves, and streets. Rome has lost such things before. What remains in question is whether the people behind this wall can leave alive when the fighting is over." That changed the room. Marcus did not propose a glorious last stand. He proposed time. If the western gate held through the morning, civilians could be moved from the exposed districts toward the river warehouses, where barges still waited. The eastern roads were not safe, but they were open. If the enemy expected to break through the gate and seize the city center quickly, a stubborn defense could force them to commit men, tools, and daylight to one place. Meanwhile, families could leave through alleys, courtyards, and narrow lanes beyond the enemy's first attention. It was not a plan to save the empire. It was a plan to save whoever could still be saved from it. Decimus frowned. "And when the gate falls?" "Then we fall back toward the old forum," Marcus said. "The streets narrow there. We make them fight for every turn." "With what?" Cassian asked. "With what we have." Sabina studied the rough map scratched into dust on the floor. "The forum is too far. If the gate breaks at dawn, they will be among the houses before we can organize a retreat." Marcus nodded. "Then we do not wait for the gate to break." That was the second decision of the night. Instead of keeping every soldier behind the wall, Marcus would send a small force out before dawn. They would move through abandoned workshops near the road, strike the enemy's forward camp, and destroy its siege tools before they reached the gate. It would not defeat the army outside Rome, but it might delay the attack, break its first momentum, and force its leaders to choose between pursuit and preparation. The officers understood the cost immediately. The force sent outside would be exposed, it might not return. The men who stayed behind would be fewer when the main attack began. Yet, if rams and ladders reached the wall intact, the defense could collapse within an hour. Lucius placed the cracked iron eagle on the dusty floor between them. "When I carried this near Aquileia," he said, "we had more men than we could count from one end of the line. We had a general who spoke from horseback about honor. We lost half the men before noon. The general rode away before sunset." He looked at Marcus. "If we send men out, you lead them." Marcus did not answer immediately. A commander was supposed to remain where he could see the whole battle. He was supposed to preserve himself for signals, reserves, and decisions. But there were no reserves. There were no distant lines to command. There was one gate, one night, and a handful of soldiers being asked to risk themselves for people already forgotten by their rulers. "I will lead them," he said. The meeting ended without ceremony. Orders moved through the bathhouse in low voices. Men were sent to gather oil jars, axes, rope, hammers, spare shields, and every arrow that could still fly straight. Cassian went into nearby streets to recruit volunteers from the watch. Sabina returned to the barracks and ordered every soldier to sleep for an hour, even those who insisted they could not. Decimus led his remaining horses to a stable courtyard and wrapped their hooves in strips of cloth. Brother Paulus went to the civilian quarter. He did not tell people that Rome would hold. He told them the Western District would be dangerous at dawn. He told them to take water, bread, blankets, and children. He told them the river warehouses would open their doors. Some listened. Some accused him of spreading panic. Some asked where the emperor was. Paulus did not answer that question. Marcus crossed the wall before dawn with a small band of soldiers. They left through a drainage channel half filled with rubble, one person at a time. The channel opened beneath a collapsed bakery just outside the city. Around them stood the broken edge of Rome, abandoned homes, burned workshops, roofless warehouses, gardens trampled by horses, and statues whose faces had been smashed for stone. A cold rain had begun to fall, soft enough to hide their movement, heavy enough to soak leather straps and turn ash into black paste beneath their sandals. Marcus led from the front, with Lucius beside him. Sabina commanded the first group behind them. Decimus and his riders moved farther west, hidden among ruined lanes, prepared to strike only when the infantry had begun its work. Tiro was there too. Marcus had ordered him to stay behind. Tiro had simply appeared at the drainage channel, carrying a bundle of oil jars. When Marcus saw him, the boy looked down at the ground, waiting to be sent back. "You can run?" Marcus asked. "Yes, Commander." "You can keep your hands steady?" "Yes, Commander." Marcus pointed to the bundle. "Then stay close to Lucius. When he tells you to move, move. When he tells you to stop, stop. Do not try to be brave." Tiro swallowed. "What if I am afraid?" "Then you will be like the rest of us." The enemy camp was not an endless field of tents. It was a scattered line of fires, carts, pickets, and rough shelters among old estates outside the city. Marcus could see only fragments through the rain. A man warming his hands, a horse tossing its head, stacked lumber under canvas, dark shapes moving between wagons. The army outside Rome was real enough, But in the night, it became a series of small human moments, each vulnerable to confusion. The siege equipment stood near the road. Covered rams had been built from fresh timber. Several ladders lay beside them. Men were fitting iron caps to the heads of beams. If those rams reached the gate, the old wood would not hold long. Marcus waited until a gust of rain swept across the road. Then he raised his hand. Sabina's soldiers moved first. They crossed the open ground in a crouch, reached the stack of ladders, and began pouring oil over the wood. Tiro followed Lucius toward the rams, clutching an oil jar against his chest. Marcus and his closest men struck the nearest sentries before the alarm could spread. There was no grand clash. One guard fell without a sound. Another shouted once, then disappeared beneath 3 shields. A third ran toward the fires, and Decimus's riders came out of the dark behind him. The first flames rose low and orange under the rain. For one breath, they seemed too small to matter. Then the oil caught. Fire crawled across the ladders, found the canvas coverings, and climbed into the wet timber beneath. Smoke rolled along the ground. Horses screamed from the picket line. Men stumbled out of shelters, reaching for weapons they could not find. Marcus shouted for withdrawal. That was when the enemy horn sounded. It came from somewhere beyond the camp, long and deep, answered by another farther away. Fires spread around the rams. Soldiers ran toward the road from every direction. Sabina's group had nearly reached cover when a burst of arrows cut through the rain. One of her soldiers fell. Another dropped his torch and turned back for him. Sabina seized the wounded soldier by his cloak. "Leave him." The man resisted. "He is alive. He is slowing everyone." The wounded soldier tried to rise and failed. The enemy was coming through the smoke now, not as a wall of bodies but in clusters, calling to one another and trying to see. Marcus had seconds to decide whether to send men back into the open. He ran toward the wounded soldier himself. Lucius followed. Tiro followed Lucius. Together they dragged the man through mud and broken boards, while arrows struck the ground around them. The soldier was heavy in his mail shirt. His blood made the cloak slippery. Marcus felt an arrow hit his shield hard enough to drive the rim into his arm. Then Decimus's riders burst across the road. There were few of them, but in the smoke and confusion they sounded like far more. Hooves hammered the wet ground. Horses shoved through men still trying to form a line. Decimus swung his sword, not searching for glory, but making space. His riders turned sharply and vanished between ruined walls before the enemy could close around them. Marcus's group reached the drainage channel as one of the burning rams collapsed in on itself. They had lost people. Others were wounded. The enemy's siege tools burned behind them. When they emerged inside the city, the eastern sky had begun to pale. For a moment, the soldiers stood in the bakery ruins, breathing hard and looking at one another. Their faces were black with smoke. Their armor dripped rainwater. Tiro still held one unbroken oil jar against his chest. Lucius looked at him. "You carried that the entire time?" Tiro nodded. Lucius took the jar, held it up, and laughed. It was the first real laugh anyone had heard that night. Then the gate horn sounded from the wall. The enemy had decided not to wait. By sunrise, the Western District was awake with movement. Civilians pushed carts toward the river. Women carried sleeping children under cloaks. Men who had never served in the army dragged stones onto rooftops. The legionaries took their places on the wall and in the gatehouse. Cassian's watchmen stood in the streets behind them with spears, axes, and whatever helmets they could find. Marcus climbed to the top of the gatehouse. Rainwater ran from the stones. Beyond the wall, the enemy had gathered along the road. The burning remains of the siege engines sent smoke across the field, but new ladders were already being carried forward. The raid had bought time. It had not bought safety. Lucius joined him with the Iron Eagle. "Do you want it on the wall?" he asked. Marcus looked at the standard. Once a legion's eagle had represented Rome's permanence. Soldiers had died to save it, because losing it meant disgrace beyond death. But this small iron bird had been made after the old one was gone. It had not witnessed great victories. It had been hammered into shape by an unknown smith for men no longer certain their legion even existed on official records. "Yes," Marcus said, "put it where they can see it." Lucius fixed the standard beside the gatehouse stair. The first attack began with arrows. They struck the parapets, the shutters, and the carts behind the wall. Soldiers raised shields over their heads and waited. Marcus watched the enemy advance through the rain, moving in uneven groups around the rubble. The loss of the rams forced them closer to the wall. That was the delay he had wanted. It also meant the battle would be decided at arm's length. Ladders came up first. Sabina's soldiers shoved them back with poles and hooked blades. One ladder tipped, throwing men into the muddy ditch below. Another reached the parapet near the damaged tower. A helmet appeared above the stones, then a hand, then a face. Sabina drove her spear downward. The man vanished. Another took his place. Marcus moved along the wall where the pressure was worst. He gave no speeches. He pointed, shouted names, shifted people from one section to another. He told archers to save arrows until they had clear targets. He ordered water brought to the wounded. When a young soldier froze beside a ladder, Marcus grabbed the man's shield, pressed it against the stone, and put him back into the line. The first hour belonged to the defenders. The wall still stood. Ladders broke or fell. The enemy lost men in the ditch and could not bring enough force through the narrow approaches at once. From the gatehouse, Marcus saw Decimus lead his riders through a side street inside the city, then out through a postern farther north. They did not charge openly. They appeared at the enemy's flank, threw javelins into men carrying ladders, and withdrew before anyone could trap them. Each small success mattered. But Rome's defenders were not fighting from strength. Every arrow spent was gone. Every wounded soldier left an empty place. Every broken shield exposed someone who could not be replaced. By late morning, the rain had stopped, and the enemy could see the wall clearly. Then they changed their method. Instead of sending ladders directly at the gate, they began attacking the damaged tower. Men with axes and hooks moved through the ruins at its base. Archers kept the parapet clear. A group of shielded soldiers worked at the old cracks in the masonry, widening them with iron tools. Sabina came to Marcus with blood on one side of her face. "The tower will go," she said. "How long?" "Before midday." Marcus looked toward the city behind them. The river route was still moving. Paulus had sent runners with word that civilians had reached the warehouses. Barges were loading. The eastern streets were crowded but open. Not everyone had escaped. There were still people in the western district. Old people unable to walk. Families trapped by collapsed buildings. Shopkeepers who refused to leave their stores until the fighting reached their doors. Men who believed the wall could not fall because Rome's walls had always stood in their minds, even while stone cracked around them. Marcus gave the order to prepare the fallback. Cassian's watchmen began placing carts across the first street behind the gate. Axes chopped at paving stones to create loose rubble. Barrels were rolled from a wine cellar and broken open so spilled oil would make the street difficult to cross. The defenses were crude, but the streets were narrow. A great army could be forced through them a few people at a time. Tiro was sent with messages between the wall and the river quarter. On his second run, he found Brother Paulus helping a woman carry an old man from a doorway. The old man had refused to leave his house because his wife was buried in the courtyard behind it. Paulus had argued with him until the tower horn sounded. Now the old man had no strength left to resist. Tiro set down his spear and took one side of the man's weight. "You should be on the wall," Paulus said. "I was told to carry messages. This is not a message." Tiro looked toward the gate, where the sound of stone breaking echoed above the roofs. "No," he said, "it is a person." Together they carried the old man toward the river. Near midday, the damaged tower came down. It did not collapse in a single clean fall. First came a crack that seemed too small to matter. Then dust poured from the joints. A section of parapet tilted outward. Soldiers stumbled back. The top of the tower broke apart, sending stone, wood, and people into the street below. The sound crossed the city like thunder. For a few seconds, both sides stopped. Then the enemy surged toward the breach. Marcus was thrown to one knee by the impact. Dust filled his mouth and eyes. He heard Lucius shouting somewhere close. He heard people calling for shields, for water, for mothers, for gods. A stone slab had crushed the leg of one soldier near the stair, and another was trying uselessly to pull him free. Marcus saw the breach through the dust. It was not wide, but it was open. Beyond it, figures were climbing over fallen masonry. He made the third decision of the night, though it was now nearly noon. He ordered the gate opened. Lucius stared at him. "The gate? Open it. You mean to let them in?" "I mean to choose where they enter." The broken tower had created an uncontrolled gap. Men could climb through it from several angles, scattering the defenders along the wall and into nearby buildings. The gate, however, opened onto one straight street. Cassian had prepared that street. It had barriers, side alleys for the defenders, and rooftops from which stones and javelins could be thrown. It was a terrible order because it looked like surrender. But surrender would have meant throwing down weapons and trusting an enemy commander whose intentions Marcus could not know. Opening the gate was not surrender. It was an attempt to turn a collapse into a corridor. Lucius understood. He gripped the iron eagle with both hands. "Then we make them pay for the road." The gate chains groaned. Men pushed the heavy leaves inward. Outside, the enemy hesitated, perhaps expecting a trap, perhaps simply surprised. Then the first soldiers ran through. Cassian's barricade met them inside the city. The defenders had formed two lines. The first carried shields and short spears. The second stood behind them with javelins, axes, and spare weapons gathered from the dead. From the roofs, civilians dropped tiles, bricks, and stones. Marcus stood near the center, with Sabina on his right and Lucius on his left. The street became a struggle for space. There was no room for elaborate maneuvers.
No wide field for cavalry. No shining line advancing under banners. Men pushed against shields, stumbled over broken carts, struck at whatever was in reach, and tried to keep their footing on wet stone. The defenders gave ground slowly, one barrier at a time. Sabina fought with her shield split from top to bottom. When her spear broke, she took a fallen sword. When a soldier beside her went down, she stepped over him without looking away from the line. Cassian moved from one side street to another, using his watchmen to strike at attackers who entered too far ahead of their companions. Marcus saw fear everywhere. He saw it in his own soldiers, in the people on rooftops, and in the enemy men who entered the street and realized they had left the open field behind them. Courage did not erase fear. It gave fear work to do. It made someone hold a shield in place while their hands shook. It made a woman carry water through falling stones. It made a boy return with a message when every instinct told him to run toward the river and never stop. Tiro returned from the warehouses in the middle of the fighting. His face was pale. His clothes were soaked with river water. He found Marcus behind the second barricade and delivered the message from Paulus. "The barges are leaving," he said. Marcus looked past him, toward the east. "How many?" "Paulus says some are full. More are still loading." "And the streets?" "Still people coming." Marcus nodded once. The message was not enough. It never could be enough. It did not tell him who had reached the river, who had been left behind, who would survive the road after the barges sailed, or whether any place beyond Rome could receive them. But it meant the defense had accomplished something real. Time had become distance. Distance had become a chance. "Go back," Marcus said. Tiro looked toward the fighting. "Commander, I can stay. You can carry the next message. There may not be one." Marcus looked at the boy's spear. The wooden shaft was scraped and blackened. His hands were trembling, but he did not hide them. "Then tell Paulus the western gate is still holding." Tiro nodded and ran. The second barricade fell soon after. An enemy soldier reached the line carrying a hooked axe and pulled Cassian's shield aside. Cassian killed him, but others came through the opening. The defenders closed around them, yet the gap had been made. Pressure built. A cart shifted. One wheel snapped. The line bent inward. Lucius was struck in the shoulder by a spear. He did not fall. He broke the shaft, lifted the iron eagle from where it had been planted beside the barricade, and carried it forward into the crush. Marcus saw him disappear among raised shields. For an instant, the standard vanished too. Then it rose again above the street. The iron bird was bent. One wing had broken off. Lucius held the staff with one hand and a sword with the other. Soldiers who saw it moved toward it, not because they believed Rome would be saved by a piece of iron, but because they knew where their own people were still standing. Marcus reached him as the third barricade was being prepared behind them. "Fall back," Marcus shouted. Lucius shook his head. "Fall back," Marcus said again. Lucius looked down at the blood spreading across his armor. "You need someone to hold this corner. We hold it together."
"No," Lucius said. "You hold the next one." Marcus wanted to argue. There was no time. Lucius planted the standard against the wall, braced his shoulder against it, and called to the soldiers around him. A small group remained at the corner. Sabina took some toward the retreat line. Cassian pulled back with the rest of the watchmen. Marcus stood for one more breath, looking at Lucius through the dust and smoke. Then he turned away. The third barricade stood near the old forum, where narrow streets opened into a square lined with ruined columns. This was the last planned position. Beyond it lay routes toward the river and the eastern districts. If it failed too quickly, the enemy would have a clear path into the fleeing civilians. But when Marcus reached it, he found that the square was not empty. People had gathered there because they had nowhere else to go. Some were waiting for relatives. Some had lost the route to the warehouses. Some carried too much to move quickly. Brother Paulus stood among them, shouting directions to families while wounded soldiers leaned against a column nearby. Tiro was beside him. "You were told to stay at the river," Marcus said. "The barges left," Tiro replied.
Paulus said the rest were coming on foot. Marcus looked at the crowd, then at the street behind him. The defense had bought hours. It had opened the river route. But no plan could make people move at the speed of an army. The final barrier was now protecting those who had not escaped in time. Sabina came to him, exhausted and furious. "Lucius is still there." Marcus knew what that meant. The enemy had not yet reached the forum because Lucius and the people of the corner were still delaying them. Marcus turned to Cassian. "Can the civilians get through the eastern lane?" Cassian looked at the crowd. "Not all at once." "Then make them move in groups. They are frightened. So are we." Cassian's expression hardened. He began shouting names of streets and neighborhoods, breaking the crowd into smaller lines. Paulus moved with him. Tiro took a child by the hand and led her toward the lane. The child's mother followed, then another family, then another. Marcus looked at Sabina. "How many can fight?" She counted without turning her head. "Too few." "And wounded?" "Too many." Marcus saw the old forum around them. Its statues had been stripped of bronze years earlier. Its paving stones were cracked by weeds. The empire had built grand spaces for ceremonies, markets, trials, speeches, and triumphs. Now the place would become a bottleneck for civilians carrying sacks of bread. He placed the remaining soldiers across the mouth of the square. The enemy reached them just after Lucius's standard fell. No one saw Lucius die. There was no final signal, no last words carried cleanly above battle. One moment the Iron Bird stood at the street corner. The next, it was gone beneath smoke and moving bodies. The people who remained with him bought the time they were asked to buy. That was all Marcus would ever know. The final battle was shorter than the others. The defenders no longer had the wall, the gate, or barricades behind them. They had a line across broken pavement and a crowd moving away through the eastern lane. Marcus stood in the center. Sabina stood beside him. Cassian's watchman held the left, where an alley opened toward the warehouses. Tiro, against every order, stood behind the line with a bundle of javelins. The first attackers entered the square cautiously. They had fought all morning. They had lost people at the wall, at the gate, and in the streets. They expected another trap.
Marcus used that hesitation. He ordered the javelins thrown only when the enemy had stepped fully into the open. Then he sent Sabina's group forward in a sudden charge, not far enough to be surrounded, only far enough to push the enemy back into the narrow street. For a few minutes it worked. The square filled with noise, iron against wood, boots on stone, shouted commands in several languages, the crash of a broken shield. Marcus struck a man at close range, felt the impact travel into his wrist, and saw the man disappear beneath the press. He had fought in battles before. He had led charges, watched cavalry break, ordered retreats, and sent people into places he knew they would not return from. Yet this fight felt different, because there was nowhere behind him except people trying to leave. Sabina was wounded in the thigh. She bound it with a strip torn from her cloak and kept standing. Cassian lost his helmet and fought bareheaded. Tiro delivered javelins until there were none left, then picked up a shield from the ground. Marcus saw him step into a gap at the left of the line.
For 1 second, the boy looked very small. Then he set the shield beside Cassian's and held it there as attackers pressed against it. Cassian glanced at him. "Stay low." Tiro said nothing. He was too busy trying not to fall. The civilians kept moving through the eastern lane. Marcus could see them only in fragments between bodies and columns. A woman carrying a basket, an old man supported by 2 strangers, a child dragging a wooden toy, Paulus turning back again and again to count whoever remained. Then the enemy found the alley on the left. Cassian's watchmen were driven back. The line began to fold toward the center. Marcus ordered a retreat to the far side of the forum, but there was no clean withdrawal. People moved backward while fighting. Wounded soldiers were carried or left. The square narrowed around the fountain at its center. Sabina caught Marcus's arm. "The eastern lane is clear," she said. He looked past her. Paulus stood at the mouth of the lane. Behind him, no civilians remained in the square. The purpose of the defense had been fulfilled. Marcus could order the survivors to keep fighting until they were surrounded. He could die in the square with the last of the legion and give the enemy a story of defiance. Or he could recognize that courage was not always remaining in place. Sometimes it was knowing when the duty had changed. He raised his sword and gave the order to withdraw. Sabina stared at him as if she had not heard correctly. "Now," he said. Cassian's men pulled back first, covering the wounded. Sabina moved with them, limping but upright. Marcus took the rear with a few soldiers. Tiro remained beside him. "You go with Paulus," Marcus told him. "No." That was not a request. Tiro looked toward the eastern lane, then at the fighting behind them. "My father stayed in the grain riot," he said. "He said someone had to keep the door open." Marcus had never known Tiro's father. He had heard the story only as another account from a city where hunger had become violence, and violence had become routine. "Your father was not a soldier," Marcus said. "No," Tiro replied, "but he stayed." Marcus could have dragged him away. Instead, he gave the boy Lucius's broken iron eagle. "Then carry this," he said, "not because it is Rome, because it tells the others where to stand." Tiro took the standard with both hands. The last soldiers withdrew through the eastern lane as the enemy entered the far side of the forum. Marcus and Tiro were the final 2 to leave.
At the lane entrance, Marcus turned once and looked back. The square was full of dust, broken weapons, overturned carts, and the bodies of people from both sides. The old columns stood around it, damaged but still upright. Beyond them, smoke drifted across the city, where Rome had spent centuries naming itself eternal. Then Marcus stepped into the lane and pulled the wooden gate shut behind him. It would not stop anyone for long. It did not need to. By evening, the Western District had fallen. Enemy troops occupied the gatehouse, the forum, and streets near the river. The imperial palace stood farther east, mostly empty. Many storehouses had been opened or looted. Some neighborhoods burned. Others remained strangely quiet, their doors barred, their inhabitants listening to footsteps outside. Marcus led the survivors toward the southern road after dark. They were no longer a legion in any official sense. No clerk would record their number.
No emperor would receive a report of their actions. They had no eagle of gold, no pay chest, no intact cohort, no certainty that the institutions they had served would exist by the next season. They had soldiers who could still walk. They had Sabina, wounded but alive. They had Cassian, who had lost many of his watchmen and refused to leave Rome until Paulus convinced him that the people on the road would need someone who knew how to organize frightened crowds. They had Brother Paulus, with his bag of bandages and lists of names. They had Tiro, carrying a broken iron bird on a staff. Behind them, Rome remained. Not the Rome of triumphal processions or imperial decrees. Not the Rome of maps colored in red, stretching from sea to sea. That Rome had been dying for years in unpaid soldiers, neglected walls, empty granaries, rival courts, and roads no longer safe for travelers. The enemy at the gate had not created every weakness. They had entered through weaknesses already made. But the city was still filled with people. Bakers, laborers, clerks, merchants, priests, children, widows, craftsmen, servants, and veterans remained among its buildings. Some would stay because they had no choice. Some would leave in the days that followed. Some would live under new rulers and discover that markets still opened. Water still had to be carried, roofs still had to be repaired, and children still had to be fed. Empires often end less cleanly than later generations imagine. A throne may disappear in a day. A title may pass to a new ruler. A banner may be pulled down from a wall. Yet ordinary life continues through ruins, because people continue through ruins. Marcus stopped the column on a ridge south of the city before dawn. From there he could see the first light touch the roofs of Rome. Smoke still rose from the western quarter. The river reflected a pale strip of sky. No horn sounded from the city. No messenger came after them. The road ahead was wet, empty, and uncertain. Sabina stood beside him, leaning on a spear now used as a walking staff. "What do we call ourselves?" she asked. Marcus looked back at the survivors. Some sat beside the road with their shields across their knees. Others slept against carts. Cassian was counting water skins. Paulus was checking the bandage around a wounded man's arm. Tiro stood apart from them all, holding the broken standard upright, because he had not yet learned that no one expected him to. Marcus considered the question. The old answer would have been simple. They were the 7th Legion. They belonged to Rome. They served the emperor. But the emperor had gone. The legion's roles were lost. Its eagle was broken.
Rome itself was behind them, occupied by enemies and abandoned by its own court. "We call ourselves what we are," Marcus said. Sabina waited. "The ones who got people out." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. They marched south after sunrise. In years to come, different people would tell different versions of Rome's last night. Some would speak of commanders who fled. Some would remember fires near the Western Gate. Some would claim that a final legion stood in the Forum until no one remained. Others would say Rome could never truly fall because its laws, language, roads, and faith continued beyond the people who had ruled from its palaces. No one would agree on every detail. No one would know the names of all the dead. But somewhere beyond the city, a small group of survivors carried food, water, wounded companions, and a broken iron eagle along a road built by an empire that could no longer command it. The empire was ending behind them. The choice to stand for someone else had not ended at all. That was what remained after the walls failed, after the court fled, after the banners disappeared in smoke. Not the certainty that Rome would last forever. Not the promise that courage would bring victory. Only the harder truth. When the world built by powerful people begins to collapse, someone must still hold the door open. Marcus did not know where the road would take them. He did not know whether the survivors would find safety, whether the wounded would live, or whether the broken eagle would ever stand above soldiers again. He knew only that, for one night, they had refused to measure duty by the survival of an empire. They had measured it by the lives behind them. And as the sun rose over the road, Tiro carried the iron bird forward. Its wing was broken. Its metal was stained by smoke and rain. Yet it remained upright in his hands, pointing not back toward the city that had fallen, but toward the people still walking ahead. Rome had been called eternal, but courage had never belonged to Rome alone.